Hi, and welcome to Tocqueville Talks. I'm Brent Nelson, your co-host, and the director of the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. I'm here with my co-host, Beth Larive, and she's going to be talking to us today about her interview with Matthias Matthijs, who is another Belgian. We heard a couple of weeks ago from Lisbeth Huge, but he too is a scholar in the United States. He's at Johns Hopkins. And not only is he a scholar, but he's also a public intellectual. Many of our listeners may read Foreign Affairs magazine, and Matthias has a piece there on some of the things that he was talking about back in November about foreign policy, Europe's foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States. So what did you talk about in November, Beth?
Yeah, so what he's going to be discussing in this interview is what he calls the Trump trap. Very fascinating account of the situation that Europe now finds themselves in. And this is the European dilemma right now, is that caving to U.S. pressure strengthens Trump politically, yet resisting traps Europe between domestic far-right gains and external economic coercion. So he gives a really sort of deepened exploration of exactly that trap that Europe finds itself in.
Well, European leaders are feeling more and more trapped, even as they see the United States attempting to claw some of their territory in Greenland. So this was a very timely topic, and this interview is just excellent. So let's go to the interview.
If you could speak a little bit about the Trump trap, and the significance of that, and then we can maybe take it in a little bit more of a monetary direction.
Yeah. All right. So, what is I think what is striking about the return of Donald Trump to the White House is, of course, the whole world had to sort of gauge how to respond to this. And in the beginning, I feel like you had the sort of China response, which was to immediately say, okay, you'll do this, tit for tat, we'll retaliate when you do this. And then other countries, smaller countries, were immediately like, okay, whatever you want, we'll just cave on all your demands. So the European Union was somewhere in between, because they very quickly said things like, well, hang on a minute, trade, we are equal size, we should negotiate as equals. We can talk about things like 0% tariffs and all the old sort of free trade ideas that the EU had. And I think very quickly they had to come to terms with the fact that they weren't going to be treated like an equal, that they didn't have much room for negotiation. And of course that interacted with Europe being strategically dependent for its security on the United States, and something that was very quickly exploited, right? So the Trump trap, in a way, it seems to me, for Europe, is that they're relatively weak right now. They're weak politically, many centrist leaders. Why are they weak? Because the far right, and some of the Gary Marx and Lisbeth Huge talked about yesterday, the rise of the far right means that there's a rise in Euroscepticism, and so at a time where you'd expect Europe, a very different European Union today versus 10 years ago, to actually use all those tools they've been developing, whether it's for anti-coercion, whether it's for investment screening, whether it's to put on their own retaliatory tariffs. They've built up this whole arsenal of geo-economic tools and of fiscal tools, and they're not using it this time. And they're not using it because they don't feel that they have the support, at least in the Commission, of all the member states. And the tragedy is as they're caving in to these things, citizens aren't very happy, right? I mean, the vast majority of Europe thinks this trade deal that Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen struck in Scotland was one-sided. I think 53% even thought it was a humiliation for Europe. And the reason why they had to strike this deal is because otherwise, you could say it would have been a lot worse. And that would have played into the hands of the far right as well. So by caving to Trump, they are making him look strong. they're also calling into question what's the point of being in the EU, because look at the UK. They're out of the EU and they're getting a better trade deal, for example, 10% instead of 15% tariffs. And so the cause of this weakness is far-right strength. And yet the far-right are the ones that are being rewarded by Trump getting stronger because it encourages imitation all over Europe. So they're kind of stuck in this vicious cycle where appeasement leads to weakening of the center, then leads to further appeasement.
So are there things going on right now in Europe to try to, I guess, mitigate the effects of the far right? Like you mentioned the tools earlier that they do have. They have these centralized tools that they're not using because of the rise of the far right. Yep. What has been the response? Has it been to maybe I'm thinking of the kind of Digital Services Act, right? Is that going to strengthen these tools? Is that part of the push right now that we're seeing? I see it in the news a lot.
No, exactly. So the other things that there is a risk that whatever they've agreed so far in this first year of the return of Trump as president, that this is now going to lead to further demands, right? For watering down the Digital Services Act, the Markets Act, the Green New Deal, and these are the kinds of things that the far right wants to see, and often team up with the center right, who are also not particularly happy about these very progressive things. So that gives them sort of win in the sales. But the tragedy of that, of course, is that it makes them more dependent on the United States. So there's this old saying that, especially in the case of Germany, but maybe for Europe overall, the weakness of Europe in the late 20-teens was that they had outsourced their growth to China. They had outsourced their energy needs to Russia, and they had outsourced their security needs to the United States. So now, given that they no longer rely on Russia for energy, and they no longer can rely on much of their growth to China because of weaponized interdependence and things like that, and the Chinese, of course, moving full steam ahead in their own economy, producing the things that Europe does now better and cheaper, the risk is they're outsourcing all three to the United States. Right? And so it makes you, even in the short term at least, more dependent on the United States, which then increases the potential for blackmail further. So how does Europe become energy independent? Well, they have to double down on the Green New Deal. It's a fossil fuel scarce continent. The only way they can move ahead is to double down on solar, on wind, on hydrogen, on these alternative forms, rather than buying American LNG that's much more expensive. Right? Same with its defense. If you're really going to rely on Article 5 for your defense, and that's interpreted as America starting a war or coming to your aid in a war, and they're not doing that, because again, Donald Trump has said, well, Article 5 is kind of how you interpret it. Right now, we're coming to Ukraine's aid, we'll give you weapons. But I think many people in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Baltics, are expecting, 30, 50,000 Marines to show up to immediately join the fight if there's an invasion, and that as working as a deterrent. So you have to kind of build up your own military industrial complex, but in the short term, what are they doing? Buying more and more American weapons, because it's the easiest way to spend money and to show that you're meeting these goals. But in the short term, then it doesn't give you much of an incentive to develop your own.
So, I mean, I'm trying to think of this in terms of Tocqueville a little bit. And I guess I could just throw it out to you. What do you see as being the Tocquevillian themes here? That maybe Europe, his audience was European, Well, is there still a message here for the Europeans in this you've cast it as kind of a dire straits,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the third theme I think Europe has scathed on the United States is on values. And of course, Tocqueville's most famous work is on democracy in the United States, in America. What you are seeing is that some of the things that the Trump administration has done, or people aligned with the Trump administration, this is sort of almost a direct election interference that you've seen. We saw it with J.D. Vance's Munich speech, that he criticized Germany and German centrist parties for not talking to the far-right AfD. He criticized the decision by the Supreme Court in Romania to ban far-right pro-Trump candidates. you've had Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, actually in a CPAC meeting in Poland, openly choosing the side of Nawrocki, who in the end actually ended up winning. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that's not done between allies, right? And so you would have 10 years ago, I think, European leaders, even 5 years ago, would have pushed back against this in a much more strong way. Similar with the sort of the role that X, formerly Twitter, played in misinformation and spreading certain Russian stories about candidates. I mean, this is the kind of stuff the European Commission normally would come down very hard on. And there is pressure of Europe to step back on this, to not push on this, to not criticize what some of the, I guess, worrying things the Trump administration is doing in the United States, out of risk of making the trade and the security negotiations or the kind of fragile status quo even more worrisome. And so whether it's NGOs that are under pressure, whether it's sort of like all of civil society that feels that, that's part of this sort of vibrant American democracy, I think that's something where the Europeans now feel, they used to have a partner in the United States in spreading democracy, and that's, I think, something that, for better or worse, they'll completely have to give up.
Well, Beth, I thought that it would be interesting for the two of us to have a conversation about this interview, partly because I study Europe and I like to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. I want to hear what you think.
But just to have the two of us in the same place when we can talk about this a little bit, I'm interested in this last point that he made about the end of the United States and Europe as kind of the power of the West, and that power not only being military or economic, but also a moral power, a power that presses forward the democratic project around the world. And he seemed to end on quite a dark note, that this condominium, this cooperation is over. Was that the impression that you got?
That was definitely the impression I got. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what you think of that point, if you kind of have a similar observation, but also where do you see that going? I mean, it was a few months ago now that we recorded this, and you had raised the point about Greenland now coming into question, and Denmark, and all kinds of European entanglements with that. So,
well, even since November, we're talking about the end of NATO.
Yeah, that's right.
Even if the United States doesn't invade Greenland, even if it buys it or does something else to get it, or even just the threat of getting Greenland has really caused European leaders to doubt American leadership and American friendship even. And that's the bedrock of NATO cooperation. And if you don't trust the United States, then the whole thing falls apart. Mm-hmm. So I think things have gotten worse since your interview. I also think that it puts Europe out on a lonely island. Mm-hmm. They're not an island. They're a peninsula of the Asian continent. So they're kind of isolated anyway, but they are really isolated ideologically now because they seem to be the only ones left who are willing to stand up for a liberal world order. And by that, we simply mean the development of international rules and international institutions or multilateral institutions that enforce those rules. That's not a world that Donald Trump is interested in. It is the world that makes it's the world that Europe feels most comfortable in, is really safest in, and it's dissipating. And they're now stuck between the big Russian power and the big American power, and neither one is really pressing for democratic advancement or even keeping their own democracies solid. Mm-hmm. not that Russia was a democracy, but the United States has definitely changed. And so I really think this is it's really scaring Europe right down to its core. It doesn't know how it can survive in a world like this. Anyway, we could have Matthias back again.
Well, I was going to say, are there other events coming up that we're going to discuss more of the European transcontinental situation?
Yeah, in March, we're going to be talking about globalization, and we're bringing a prominent European thinker, Josef Brummel from Germany, is going to be coming in. He represents sort of a centrist Christian democratic sense of the world. But then we're bringing two Americans as well who work on trade issues and globalization. One from more the libertarian side, free trade, free and open markets, and another one from American Compass, which is kind of tied to the Trump administration and very much pro-tariff, pro-protection. So it's a new world. And we've heard here how Europe is having to adjust. Well, the whole globe is going to have to adjust to America that is not in favor of globalization any longer.
Well, given that decades seem to be happening in weeks, we can expect that a lot will have changed by the time we put out that interview for that event. But what are those things that do you think are staying the same nonetheless? How does the themes of the Tocqueville Center? What would you highlight as being kind of the most relevant to this international situation?
Well, I think just the question, does liberalism matter any longer? And by liberal, I mean emphasis on freedom, emphasis on human equality, the kinds of things that Tocqueville was very interested in. And I think Tocqueville is more and more relevant to us today because he asked the question way back in the early 19th century, what would it take for democracy to survive? He saw a lot of potential problems with democracy. And, we love Tocqueville in America because he praised us for so many things. But we forget that he also pointed out the dangers of democracy. And one of them was that individual citizens can become so individualistic and separated from other citizens in the society that they forget that they're working for a common good. And religion, civic associations sort of check that tendency. But what if we're secularizing? What if we no longer join bowling leagues or swim clubs? Do we lose our democracy? And the other thing he was very concerned about was despotism, that one person could harness the energy of the mob and harness the energy of the administrative state and then lose democratic values. And so this is going on in Europe as well with the rise of the far right that very much distrusts liberalism is happening in America. So we're seeing this connection across the ocean once again, and Tocqueville is our point of contact. And if you want to learn more about the Tocqueville Center and all the things we're doing here, just Google Tocqueville Center at Furman University and be sure to follow this podcast and rate us when you get a chance. Thank you. Goodbye.